So first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to first thank and acknowledge and welcome our two guests. So on my far right, your far left, is Professor Michael Abramowicz from the GW Law School in Washington, D.C. And right next to me is Professor Jennifer Lawless from the University of Virginia's Politics Department. And our third scheduled guest, Craig Holman from Public Citizen, was unfortunately in a car accident and is unable to travel to be with us. But we will have a terrific conversation here with Professor Abramowicz and Professor Lawless. Let me also just acknowledge the back there, my co-director, Professor Wilfred Codrington, and our center director, Hui Yang, for all of their hard work. Our two student fellows, Julie Horowitz and Sam Sanchez, both of whom, for their own respective reasons, aren't able to be here today, but were massively helpful in putting together the event and in putting together a lot of the conversation we're going to be having today. So this event is, or the topic of our discussion today is a little bit of, I hope, a interesting and novel amalgam, but we're going to want to talk a little bit about ways in which new technology and some new trends in technology, such as prediction markets, betting markets, crypto, the manosphere, Joe Rogan, all these things I sort of put under the loose heading of the bro economy, and talk about how that works, how that's been developing, and how that might influence our democracy. So we're going to leave some time for questions at the end, but I'm going to begin asking Professor Abramowicz just to talk a little bit about what a prediction market is. So Professor Abramowicz has written a book. It's now a prescient book from a few years ago called Predictocracy. And so I'm going to ask him to begin just by setting the table for us. What is a prediction market? How is it different from betting? And then we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll bring in this broader conversation. So
sure,
take it away.
Sure. And so prediction market can be a lot of things in terms of once one actually looks at how things are structured. But I think I can describe briefly sort of the general or the kind of most common design. And they've been used most, I think, to predict political outcomes. But here's the basic idea. Let's suppose we want to, let's suppose we're getting an early start in predicting the 2028 presidential election. Somebody sponsoring a prediction market, and there are a bunch of them online, could, for example, sell shares in different possible candidates, right? So you could have a share corresponding to J.D. Vance winning the 2028 election, a share corresponding to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez winning the election, Donald Trump winning his third term, and so on and so forth, maybe a share for other, right? So they could come up with a lot of names and then have others, and essentially decree that the shares corresponding to the winner will be worth some fixed amount, let's say $100, okay? So let's say it's $100, and then essentially just allow people to buy and sell these things. That's kind of the simplest design for a prediction market. And you watch what happens, and you see what the price is at which different people are trading these shares. And that price can be thought of as corresponding to a probability that the market as a whole thinks that person will win the election. So a prediction market, broadly speaking, is some kind of device, often involving buying and selling, but you can have kind of variations where it's a little bit of a strained metaphor for collecting and aggregating people's information and beliefs about future events.
Okay. So in order for these prediction markets to be sort of reliable, I mean, so one version is that it's just fun, right? It's just like, let's make some guesses and see what happens, right? At another extreme might be that we use them to make either reliable sort of choices about what we think the electorate wants or what we think the public wants, and use them as tools of policymaking. You've written a little bit about that as well, so I just want to push the metaphor out, or push the tool out to the policymaking side as well.
Sure, and so there's and there's different ways we might do that. So one thing to think about, for example, is let's just suppose there's some kind of information about the future that is relevant to policy. So some people, for example, have written about using prediction markets to forecast changes in average temperature as a way of gauging climate change. Or it could be something much more mundane. Let's suppose we have a particular school district, and we want to know, well, how many children are likely to be going to the K through 12 schools like 10 years from now, so we can make informed decisions now about, whether to build a new school or where to build it or something like that. But you can use prediction markets, and you can actually potentially use subsidized prediction markets, because this might be less fun, right? The political markets have enough fun that you really don't have to subsidize them. You can get pretty good information. But as you get sort of more obscure, you might want to actually subsidize them. So it's kind of a positive sum game for the players to get people to make predictions. That's kind of one possibility, right? The prediction market as input. A further, more adventurous possibility, which we could talk about at some point if you'd like, is that you could potentially have a prediction market that forecasts, whose forecast directly determines policy. So for example, one thing that I talk about in my work is something that I call predictive cost-benefit analysis. And the idea is, let's say there's something we're trying to decide whether to do. I don't know, maybe we're deciding whether to change the level of a chemical in the water. It could be just about anything, though. Right? It's the kind of thing that we might, in Washington, use cost-benefit analysis to assess. Well, one problem with cost-benefit analysis is it actually ends up, there's a lot of room for subjectivity in cost-benefit analysis, right? When you have a cost-benefit analysis in the Biden Office of Management and Budget, it's going to be very different from cost-benefit analysis in the Trump Office of Management and Budget. So one thing you might imagine doing is saying, hey, we'd like to kind of smooth that out. We'd like to make this kind of less contingent on who the particular president is. And so let's decide that 10 years from now, we don't know who the president's going to be in 10 years, we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis. And right now, we're just going to predict what the result of that cost-benefit analysis is going to be. And let's use that prediction as an input, or perhaps the sole basis, for a decision about whether to implement the relevant policy.
And so my maybe layperson impression, but there's been some journalism on this, is that the participants in a lot of these prediction markets tend mostly to be young men, sometimes also not American, right? So folks out of the country betting on things, but putting that to the side for the second, there's this, this is not uniformly spread across the population. And so we can bring in some of your work as well. To the extent that prediction markets are becoming more of a thing, and we can talk, I guess, a little bit about whether and why they're becoming more of a thing, is there concern that the sort of gender spread in sort of who's participating might have implications for policy outcomes or even election outcomes?
Yeah. So, I mean, excuse me. So the first thing to keep in mind is that when people see stories about these prediction markets, or when people are reading these results, a lot of voters and lay people are thinking about them the way that they think about polls. And so the same way that there are these bandwagon effects with polls, where like the poll says that candidate X is in the lead, and then that person often does in fact pick up a lead, because in the next poll people want to say that they're voting for the winner. What these prediction markets can do is sort of skew people's perceptions of who's winning and who's losing. And polls are problematic enough. I mean, I think, but there you're at least trying to approximate a national random sample or a state sample in a battleground state of who the electorate will be. The challenge becomes, are you getting that sample right? It might be that you're off a little bit in terms of gauging whether Joe Biden is going to win or Donald Trump is going to win because of the demographics. It might be you're off a little bit because of predictions about voter turnout. But the goal is still to make sure that you're getting a sample that looks like the probable electorate. With these prediction markets, that's not at all what the sample is, but they're still going to behave the same way or have the potential to behave the same way. So if a lot of young men, many of whom are not living in this country, are going to be flooding the market with predictions that in this past election cycle favor Donald Trump, that can have real implications about people's ideas about the likelihood that Donald Trump is going to, in fact, win the election. And then that can change their behavior. So separate and apart from the policy implications that are potentially gendered, just the entire sense of what the electorate looks like versus what the people who participate in these prediction markets look like is really key. The other thing to keep in mind is that in every presidential election since 1980 and in all congressional elections since 1986, women have actually been more likely than men to turn out to vote. And women have systematically been more likely than men to cast a ballot for the Democratic candidate. Now, that's not to say that all women vote for the Democrat and that all men vote for the Republicans. Women of color are particularly likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. White women, especially those who are not college educated, tend to vote Republican. But there are general gender trends that we know about turnout and about vote choice. And these prediction markets, to the extent that they become self-fulfilling prophecies, flip all of that on its head.
Yeah, so good, because I think maybe we have some agreement, but also a little bit of disagreement. I'm less worried that the composition of the pool of who plays the prediction markets will have a large effect. And there was some early research on one of the early prediction markets called the Iowa electronic markets in one of its first years when Michael Dukakis was the Democratic nominee for president. And they actually looked at how different people were buying and selling. So they actually asked them, well, what are your political preferences? So they knew whether they were Democrat or Republican or whether they leaned toward one candidate or the other. And then they actually kind of monitored their trades and took a look to see whether, who they were buying and selling. And in fact, there were quite a few people who would only trade in accordance with their policy preferences. So if you were a Democrat and you were one of these people, you would only buy Dukakis maybe at the relevant times, and you would only, on the other side, you would, let's say, sell the Dukakis share at those times. But there were a few people who seemed to go kind of back and forth, right? Sometimes they would buy, sometimes they would sell, obviously also with different shares. And essentially what the study seemed to show is that those people were effectively determining the market price. So the people who could kind of put aside their own preferences a little bit and look at what they're thinking about are the people who are most likely to actually affect what that prediction is. So even if one, has a particular political preference or particular demography, if it's a particular demography, you still have the incentive to think about, well, to look at evidence like polls, right? So polls, I don't see as an alternative to prediction markets. Polls are an input into prediction markets. And indeed, this past election cycle, there was a little bit of controversy anyway, because there was a point at which the market started moving dramatically, the prediction markets, in Trump's direction, enough so that people actually kind of figured out it was because of really one or two, a small number of traders or a small number of accounts that ultimately might have been from the same person. And eventually they actually kind of figured out what was going on. And it was one person, a French man, who had, I can't remember, I think it was like something like half of his wealth, put in $25 million or something like that, into Trump shares. And the question was why? And he had actually commissioned a poll, and it wasn't a poll of people's individual preferences, it was a poll where they asked people, well, who do you think your neighbors are going to vote for? Which, as I understand, there's some research suggests is generally a pretty good way of doing a poll, and there haven't been very many of those released in this cycle, and he became convinced Trump was going to win. So now, could potentially somebody kind of make a misprediction and that go too far? Sure, that's possible. But at least in this particular example, it seemed like he was actually bringing some new information into the market. I don't think primarily these prediction markets do a great job of bringing in new information. Mostly they're aggregating the information that's out there because the barrier to entry it's very expensive to actually produce new information. But this was sort of an exception to that.
So I think that that's generally right, but something that has changed in the most recent election cycle, and will probably move forward, is the media cycle, right? And so in the 24-hour news environment where, although there actually is 24 hours of legitimate news to cover, no one seems interested in that, these are the kinds of stories that wind up getting played over and over and over again. And so what happened, something that, I was teaching an election 2024 class to 500 students, and they were obsessed with this because they were like, everything that we're reading says that Trump is going to win because of these markets. And I'm like, okay, but it's a little bit more nuanced. They're not that interested in the nuance, right? And so, and when the headlines on CNN and MSNBC and certainly Fox News are either saying, "Oy, prediction markets are, going to be the bane of our existence," or "Oy, we should listen to prediction markets because they're going to be able to forecast the outcome of the election," those stories, even if the stories themselves do provide information and are nuanced, often are not what are getting the attention. It's those headlines. And so, something that's a little bit complicated, I think that something that becomes problematic is that the background is a little bit complicated. Like the 5 minutes of background that you got, a lot of people don't have. And so I think that that's one of the concerns as well. And then the other piece that's related to that I think has the potential to be somewhat problematic is there's this general notion that like, well, we don't like foreign interference in our elections, right? And so we know what foreign interference looks like in a traditional way. Is this foreign interference? This is a guy who's not doing anything illegal. He's not like he's not having Dominion reprogram voting machines, but at what point does that become something where, I mean, because of what he did, the narrative was able to be modified and a lot of attention was placed. Now, as a political scientist, I was excited that there was a lot more attention placed on question wording and the fact that if you actually ask your neighbors what they think, it's a better reflection of, what's probably going to happen than if they just ask you because of social desirability concerns. But again, that needs a 3 or 4 minute background discussion, and you don't get that when you're watching.
Yeah, and I agree with you a lot of what you said there, and certainly one problem I think if we're worried about the effect of markets on voting, and I don't necessarily think that prediction markets are I'm not sure polls are particularly beneficial either, so we can kind of come back to that, but I don't have a strong position one way or another on whether markets are beneficial in the sense that they provide important information to the political process. I think they can provide hypothetically this kind of information about, to school boards and, all kinds of things for actual decision making where it makes sense for the decision to depend on the future. But one problem is that, people aren't that great with probability, right? So I think that, what happened with the markets here, even people who understand probability, like it goes from 50 to I don't know what it was, 56 or something in a small percent, in a small period of time. And then the narrative is, Trump is going to win. Like, well, no, it's 60, let's say it's 60%. There's 40% chance that he doesn't win. Right? But people just see who's leading. Now, I think you can see that with polls as well sometimes, right? I mean, it's like, and now, people have gotten a little more sophisticated about things like margin of error and so on. But, but even so, when you hear, Trump leading or, Harris leading, in the polls, well, given the size of error, it doesn't necessarily mean that much, right? If there's a bunch of sources of uncertainty that could go plus, several points or down several points, the fact that one person's ahead, by a point it means something, but it doesn't mean as much as people maybe make it out to be.
So everything you said about, polls have their own problems and communication problems as well. I agree with that. I want your reaction to this. Maybe it's just because we've had polling for longer. I don't think it is. The prediction market thing just feels ickier to me, right, than polling does, right? That like it's one thing to ask people how they plan to vote or how their neighbors or how they think their neighbors plan to vote. And it's another to sort of take bets on democracy. And I don't know if that's just a sort of visceral feeling that like shouldn't mean anything and doesn't, right? Or if there's something to that visceral feeling. So I'm curious what you both think about that.
Go ahead.
Okay, sure. So, and maybe this kind of starts tying us into, the bro economy, and maybe people approach it in different ways. So actually, when I first heard the topic of, bro economy, I was wondering why was I invited? I don't research, I don't research gender studies, and then I thought about it and I realized, at long last, I'm being recognized as a bro after years of failure. This is very exciting. So, where was I? We were I'm so excited about
visceral.
This. Yeah, visceral reaction.
Yeah.
And so maybe people have different kind of visceral reactions to different kinds of mechanisms, and maybe men on average, find more interesting some of these ideas about, changing. Using kind of market mechanisms, let's say broadly speaking, in politics. I was thinking, after I started thinking about, scholars in my area versus more broadly, and I thought, yeah, it's true. It's a little male-dominated, even relative to kind of other things I work in. There are certainly exceptions. There are certainly women who work on kind of, in this space, but, it's a little bit more male than female, and maybe that, I don't know exactly what that reflects, and maybe we can talk about that in a bit. I don't have a negative reaction to integrating markets and politics. To some extent, I think that markets and politics do the same thing. I mean, what markets and politics do is they kind of they aggregate information and beliefs. And if anything, to some extent, when somebody's willing to sort of put money behind what they claim, I almost see it as less icky, right? Because if somebody just says, oh, I think this is going to happen, and if they just kind of mansplain it, let's say, then, who knows whether they really believe that? Maybe they're just trying to show off or something like that. If you kind of back it up with, a willingness to spend money, at least you're being more credible.
Yeah, so I have the ick visceral reaction for a couple of reasons. The first is, something does seem wrong with explicitly betting on democracy, even though, look, the reality is, how many of you have ever been to an election party where you've figured out, I won 2 years ago, I got every Senate race, right? I won $50. So it's not like this is something, but that seems like March Madness. It doesn't seem like, choosing the leader of the free world with potential implications. So a piece of it is that. Another piece to me, though, is, the demographic divides in terms of who does participate here. And if we believe that a representative democracy really should be equal to everybody, and if we believe that everybody should feel, regardless of race or sex or ethnicity or age or income, that there is a place for them to vote and to participate and to be an engaged citizen, then when this one, and polling, as flawed as it is at least trying to approximate that group, right? The people who are the most active participants here are not representative. And so it just seems like a bunch of very unrepresentative people potentially affecting disproportionately, if not the actual outcome, certainly the information people have as they then think about who they want to vote for. The other thing that I would say is, Elon Musk spent, $250 million on the election. It's unclear if he thought that Trump was going to win. It didn't matter. The $250 million doesn't matter. He's now just saying he's going to give another $100 million. Regardless of whether he thinks it's going to be effective, and it doesn't really cost him anything in the broad scheme of things, that action conveys to a lot of people that, because that's so much money, that, he knows something that everybody else doesn't know, or he knows that this administration is going to be able to do X, Y, or Z in a way that other people don't know it. And to me, that's also part of the ickiness. It's not a matter of congressional debate and deliberation or people inside the administration figuring out what's going on to issue an executive order. There's this now explicit sort of paying for access and paying for influence. And to me, it's linked back in some ways to, a lot of what we're seeing with these markets.
Maybe it gives the impression of something corrupt, that you must know something, and that's why you're.
Or even so that's one possibility. Or even if it's not, it's you must know something because you're willing to put so much money where your mouth is. I'm gonna consider you more credible than I might consider some other source because look at what you've sacrificed in putting it forward.
So, I haven't thought deeply about the big question about to what extent should people be allowed to spend their own money to influence politics. That brings a lot of question. Yes. I know a lot of people, have talked a lot about that, and I can certainly see the concern about somebody with a lot of money being able to spend $350 million, I guess, if we're adding it all up, to influence elections. I'm less concerned about who voluntarily chooses to participate in a prediction market, just as I might be less concerned if we found out, I don't know, you may know, I don't, that polling companies, CEOs, for example, might be more likely to be male rather than female. Or if we think about who are kind of the leading pundit talking heads on, politics analytics. I could think of Nate Silver and Harry Enton, and I don't know. Right. So, but when they talk, they're trying to talk about that broader electorate. So I think just as the pollsters are trying to capture that broader electorate, I think people who are playing prediction markets, I don't know what their demographics are. Obviously, for one thing, they're all people with money to spend, so that affects the population to some extent right there. But I think they're trying to figure out what the actual population, what the actual population will do. And if we, actually kind of push forward on, what I care more about, less than using prediction markets in elections and actually integrating it in government, then I think one advantage of prediction markets is we could say, look, we're going to have a decision later on that where it'll be relatively informed. Maybe we'll pick, for example, maybe this cost-benefit analysis, for example, could involve some, randomly selected members of the public who get to hear in detail lots of evidence. So we can kind of predict what the outcome would be with, some kind of, essentially demographically balanced panel. Maybe it won't actually turn out to be balanced, but ex ante it could be. And so that kind of forces people to think about what would different people decide with regard to this issue.
And I definitely want to come back to that point about the sort of how we might use it in policymaking in a little bit. Do you have a...
Yeah, I just want to mention briefly, so the underrepresentation of women is everywhere, right? I mean, so whether you're looking at politics where 80% of the United States Congress is male, whether you're looking at law firms and you look at the the partners, although women are now graduating from law schools at higher rates than men, partners in law firms still are not, CEOs of companies, top leaders in companies, tenured professors across the board, the heads of political organizations, chiefs of staff on Capitol Hill, all very, very male dominated. Media elites. One difference from my perspective is that these people are also held accountable by some entity in a way that in these prediction markets, like the people that are choosing to participate are not necessarily. So some of it, I think that's part of why I'm able to get up in the morning and navigate the world, even though it is so male dominated still. The ick factor seems a little bit less egregious there, just because there is this accountability. And there's also this general notion that there's something fundamentally wrong when it comes to politics with a political system that's representing 50% of the country as women, and our elected officials don't in any way, shape, or form look like that. What I think had provided some sort of normative, it made people feel okay normatively, was that women were still at least more likely than men to vote, to engage in other types of political participation. The only difference was that men are more likely than women to contribute to campaigns, but that's when you look at the actual dollars, not the act of giving. Women are just as likely as men, to write that check in the first place. It's just because they're not making as much money overall, the aggregate amount is not the same.
So I share your concern that our political representatives are not at all balanced and are heavily men. I'm not sure I understand your point about accountability, though. I mean, I understand, okay, you could say that, and you referred to lots of different areas. So yes, I can see that a particular representative is accountable in the sense that they have to come up for re-election. I think you included tenured professors. We're not super accountable to anyone. But the prediction market participants, I mean, they're accountable in the sense that if they make a bad prediction, they lose money. I mean, that's a fairly direct form of accountability.
Right, but that's just their personal choice, right? So like sure. A person can, like when Elon Musk loses $100 million, it doesn't affect his life. And I mean, so they could be choosing how much money they're willing to lose for it to really in any way, shape, or form matter. Whereas if you're a man in corporate America or in a law firm, or the choices that you make, there are sometimes consequences for them that are not just sort of your own, like, oh, I'm gonna have less money today. I also think the reason that politics is a little bit different here is that we have, as a nation, and up until this election cycle, Republicans agreed with this, have been striving to generate more equal representation in all types of political activism and participation and discussion and debate and deliberation, right? So you see it not only in terms of voter turnout, but in other types of participation. You see it when you watch the cable news shows and you look at the panels of the composition of women and men. You see it when you're talking about lobbyists and the top firms trying to say that they're going to, when they're lobbying, for any issue, they want to have similar numbers of women and men because they don't want there to be women's issues anymore. There has been this sort of push to generate some semblance of gender parity, and this is just, I mean, in some ways, this is just sort of like the latest thing. So maybe that will change, but I think that's why in politics it feels a little bit different.
One of the other things, and this is really neither here nor there, but I'm moderating, so I get to say what I want. There's, as with anything, there's the thing and then how the thing is done, right? And so a week or so ago, Polymarket, one of the prediction market entities, had a tweet asking people to predict on whether Zelensky would apologize to Trump. And they had this sort of AI generated picture of him like on his knees crying. And this got a lot of attention on Twitter for like, look, this is what prediction markets are. It's like gross men making fun of situations, right? And it's easy to sort of criticize Polymarket for doing that, but that's not necessarily prediction markets, right? That is that prediction market making that maybe insensitive, framing of a question or whatever, right? And so I think it's easy to get sort of caught up in, well, this is how it worked last time. This French guy bet $25 million and this is what happened, right? But that's not the same as, I think, what, Michael, you're articulating, sort of in principle, how could this work? I think you make the compelling case that it could have all these benefits. Maybe it's not being always executed in a way that's the most sort of constructive to policymaking or sophisticated, whatever. But that's not the thing. That's just how it's executed. Is that fair?
Yeah, and so if you ask me, do I think the current kind of prediction markets that we have on elections, like add value or subtract value, I don't really have a very strong view. I think maybe they add a little value. To me, they mostly add value in the sense of kind of illustrating these mechanisms that could be potentially used in other places. But sometimes but people really start to get the ick when you talk about that. So I think early on, for example, one of the early kind of experiments with prediction markets was by the Defense Advanced Research Products Agency, DARPA, and essentially they thought, we in the intelligence community we kind of need to be able to make predictions about what happens in other countries, and so let's do all kinds of predictions. They had economic indices and so on and so forth, but they also had like a couple predictions about whether particular people would be assassinated, and that obviously leads to that sort of ick reaction, and then the whole thing got, it was a huge public relations disaster. The whole thing got canceled. But the underlying point that, hey, it would be nice if our policy was based on reasonable predictions about, what's happening in the world, or ideally you can make conditional predictions. What would the effects of policy be? And wouldn't it be nice if eventually people realize, hey, this kind of sort of works, so that we don't just have to all have kind of different views about things like tariffs and all kinds of other policies, but we can kind of realize, hey, there are people who have thought about this in detail, and so it might make sense epistemically to defer to them collectively about the effects of policies. To me, that would be a benefit, even if there is this sort of ick factor, because, obviously, no one likes to think about people betting on life. So we do it in life insurance, right? Maybe life insurance is kind of icky too when you realize there's somebody else on the other side of that bet.
So that's actually that's a nice segue. So I personally find it ickier to bet on the elections than the policy making side. But that's because, like, deep down, I'm actually a technocrat, right? I think that solving a lot of social problems, there are discoverable answers through, expertise and rigorous research, right? And this can be a component of that, a component, not the determinant, right? But suppose I'm not such a technocrat, and suppose I actually believe more in just a government by representative democracy. Then I think I would feel just as icky, maybe even more icky, about the market's use in policymaking because the market's not choosing the winner of the election, right? That's just gambling on the outcome. And Jen, to your point, it might be shaping it, but it's not actually choosing it. And so fundamentally there, the people are still making the choice and voting. And if I really believe that on policymaking also the people should be making the choice, shouldn't I be worried about the prediction market's role there? Isn't the fact that I'm okay with it, just me personally, more attributable to the fact that I actually don't believe in democracy?
Okay, is that for me?
That's for you, yeah. And then for you, but yeah.
Right. So so certainly one big question I think in democracy is, to what extent do we think of our democratic institutions as tools for implementing the kind of policies that lead to results that we want, versus tools for implementing what we think we want right now without really thinking all that deeply about it, right? And I think that's obviously a tension in all kinds of political issues. You mentioned you had a program on state ballot initiatives, right? So certainly state ballot initiatives, right? Maybe that's a good way of figuring out, hey, in those 10 seconds in the ballot box, what does somebody think? Hey, is that a good idea or not? To me, that is, I would put less emphasis on that and more on, can we actually kind of figure out this kind of technocratic mechanisms? And there's lots of different things, I agree, that go into technocratic mechanisms for actually achieving the values that we might want. Maybe we should vote on what some of those goals should be when there are trade-offs, right? What do we care about? To what extent do we care about equity? To what extent do we care about economic growth and so on? But let's face it, the average person, and I certainly include myself in that, doesn't really have a heck of a lot of knowledge on exactly what policies are going to lead to those outcomes.
Yeah, I think it varies by policy. I think there are some policies where you would ask the average person and they have no idea, right? They really are sort of technocratic kinds of policies. There are other policies where people have very, very strong views, whether it's gun control or reproductive rights. And this I don't think is particularly helpful in a case like that, right? So I think the same way that, you know, we sometimes hold our elected officials more accountable for issues that we really understand and not that much for issues that we don't, the same kinds of dynamics are at play here. You know, for a long time, there were political scientists who were engaged in work that was sort of called deliberative democracy. And what they would do is they would recruit like 150 people to come to a resort for the weekend, give them a survey ahead of time about like some pretty obscure issue like water policy or, you know, sewage treatment plants in a particular area. They would then spend the weekend at this resort getting educated on these nuances, but also playing golf and having fun. And then at the end, now that they were sort of like fully informed and fully knowledgeable, they were asked if their views changed. And it turned out that their views did systematically change, but these were issues that were not issues that were sort of strongly linked to their own personal views or morals or ethics. And so in cases like that, I think this can be super helpful. When it's a more personal kind of issue, I think that the trade-offs are too significant.
Makes sense. So I want to shift gears a little bit and maybe zoom out and situate this in the context, and this is really going to be for you mostly, Ben, at the start, in the context of this broader set of sort of young men in elections, right? So that's the Joe Rogan of it all. It's right. And so like, why is that happening? Where is that move coming from? And what do you think about it?
I think people can probably guess what I think about it. So where it comes, so Donald Trump, when he ran in 2016, tapped into something that was very, very real that I think Democrats were not fully aware of. You can't make something out of nothing in general. And so what Trump was able to do was identify different groups of people who felt like they had been left behind, whether it be by the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, government in general. We saw that among blue-collar workers in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. We saw it in particular among working class people across the country, even in blue states. And he capitalized on that. And part of the way he was able to do it, part of the way he was able to mobilize the fact that they felt like they were left behind, was by conveying to them the argument that it wasn't random that they were left behind. It was that all of these other groups were taking what was theirs. So the notion of illegal immigration tied into that. Like if we didn't have all of these illegal immigrants here taking your jobs, you would have a better job. That recipe worked in 2016. This time around, and we saw a little bit of, there was a little bit of sort of like gender wars going on there too, because most of the people that felt left behind were men. This time around, he was far more explicit. And so it wasn't only about illegal immigration. This time around, it was about how diversity, equity, and inclusion, a term that, by the way, a year ago, the average American never would have heard of and didn't understand. It was about how diversity, equity, and inclusion, in particular, women, people of color, trans people, were taking everything from you, and especially these young men who were now stuck living in their parents' basements, who were never going to get good jobs, and the world didn't have to look like this. If you could sort of like put your trust in Trump, he would change that narrative. And because that message had worked, a lot of political scientists have shown, because that message worked in 2016 regarding illegal immigration, he was willing to give it a shot this time around, even though initially people were like, what are you talking about? This isn't going to resonate, and it did. And then the reach of podcasters like Joe Rogan, the fact that Barron Trump apparently identified all of these podcasts that most people had not really heard of, but that, you know, guys between the ages of 18 and 22 were listening to constantly. It was a really, really micro-targeted approach. And they then went to college campuses and they talked to thousands of fraternities. And they would go to a college campus and not have a big rally, right? Kamala Harris would go to a college campus and have a huge rally trying to bring everybody out. Somebody from the Trump campaign would go to a college campus and identify 80 people that they would totally get on board. And then those 80 people would go around and make sure that the 800 people that they knew on that campus were going to register to vote and vote particularly for Trump. So I think some of it was this recognition that a strategy that was employed, not geared specifically to young men in 2016, worked. And again, though, it's not taken out of nothing. Like I see it in my own college students. Like there is this general sense that young men today do feel like it's harder for them and that they have to walk on eggshells. And that now, whether this is true is a totally different question. There are some, I think there are some examples where probably it is. But this narrative has taken on a life of its own because everybody can find an example in their own lives where maybe that happened. And so it doesn't have to be something that's systemic. It just has to be something that you can relate to. And I think that's the genius of Trump, and it's the genius of his communication strategy. And, you know, he just did it differently. Apparently, Harris was trying to get on Joe Rogan, and it happened too late. But my bet is that the Democrats, the same way that in 2020, they ran Joe Biden to try and chip away at the blue collar gains that Trump had made in 2016. My bet is that in 2028, the Democrats are going to do everything that they can to chip away at the advantages that Trump began accruing among young men.
Which is probably why we see like California Governor Gavin Newsom going on all these, or having on his podcast, all these right-wing personalities, like Steve Bannon or what's his name. Yeah. So you mentioned, you know, sort of the young men in their parents' basement or whatnot, right? Again, it's purely impressionistic, not data-driven, but the impression that I think is often offered in the media is that these young men are also spending their time listening to these podcasts and betting, whether it's on sports or on elections or whatever, right? And, you know, they're not the $25 million Frenchmen, right? But it's small amounts of money, whatever it is. And so that's where I've seen or been seeing this connection, right? It's increasingly disaffected young men looking for solutions, right? And getting excited about politics, which is a good thing, right? More young people should be excited about politics. And if these are ways in for their excitement, then like in the abstract, that strikes me as a good thing. And there's a part of me that's like, well, you can't fault the guy for having a winning strategy. This was, you know, a good use of his campaign resources on campus. I didn't know about the fraternity strategy. I think that's fascinating. I think you're right that Democrats would be smart to try to, you know, follow the strategy that won and try to make it work for their own aims and benefits. But Michael, do you see any sort of resonance between, I mean, I know it's not exactly your area, but between, you said you had a college-age son, so maybe there's something there. Between sort of this sort of shift in how young men are feeling or thinking about the world, about politics, and how prediction markets might play a role for them.
Yeah, so perhaps. So, you know, and so let me just say a couple things. So first of all, I think, you know, it's interesting that the polarization by sex that we see in the United States is happening around the world too. I mean, I think in Germany and South Korea, I mean, really in the last, I don't know, not so many years, we just see this sudden divergence in political preferences. There's always some, but I think it's become a lot larger, which suggests, I think, that even though I think maybe Trump has had a talent for figuring out how to exploit it or figuring out that it was even there, that there's something broader happening. And I'm not sure what that is. I mean, my hunch is that it relates to the internet, to social media, and perhaps the gambling, broadly speaking, is part and parcel of the of social media. But I do think gambling, obviously, is much older. I mean, political prediction markets, by the way, are very old. I mean, we've had them really for in some form for well more than 100 years. And I do think that maybe to the extent, again, I'm not an expert on exactly how this arises, but I think that there is perhaps, this is my very unscientific perspective, some difference in the extent to which males and females like to engage in sort of directly competitive activities versus collaborative activities. I'm also coaching my daughter's softball team, and they can be pretty darn competitive. So, this is obviously a very stylized observation, but I do think gambling, and, I just hear my son with his friends, and, there's a lot, I think, in general, when you hear like teenage boys kind of talking with one another of, kind of disagreeing about this or that, in sports. And, sometimes you'll hear, oh, do you want to bet or whatever? And I think the betting kind of serves as a vehicle for channeling this kind of disagreement, this kind of perpetual disagreement, which is sort of central to male bonding. So But I don't think that prediction markets or gambling are really the explanation for this broader phenomena so much as something that happens to be going along with things like social media that independently might be causing some split.
That was actually going to be my next question, talk about social media.
Well,
in
so
general, yeah.
I just think that something to keep in mind here also is that as I mentioned, every presidential election since 1980, women have been more likely than men to vote for the Democrat. Men have been more likely than women to vote for the Republican. That doesn't mean they always favor different candidates. Men and women overwhelmingly went for Reagan over Mondale. But generally, the strategy has been focusing on female voters. And so when the Democrats can exploit the gender gap and get a greater percentage of women, they tend to win the election. And when the Republicans traditionally could mitigate the gender gap and make a compelling argument to female voters, they would tend to win. They don't have to win the majority of women out there. They just have to close the gap. What Trump did differently, and we've seen this in some European countries as well, is flip the gender gap on its head and not make it about getting women's votes. He made it about getting men's votes. And so the Democrats were still out there figuring out how to ensure that they could get the greatest percentage of female voters. And what Trump decided to do instead was not worry about chipping away at that margin. He decided to play on a totally different playing field. And he was going to get these men. And the men who were ripe for picking were these young men who were the least likely to be engaged in politics in the first place. So I think that was what changed. And it links to social media and it links to these podcasts, because the way that he was able to excite and mobilize and activate these men who traditionally are just not that relevant in political campaigns. It's usually the women that are out there. That's what he did. Yeah. And he did it through these mechanisms that everybody's accustomed to, right? If you ask college students right now where they get most of their political news, they say TikTok, right? I mean, like, that's where they're getting everything. Trump was there all the time. And we saw this also in Republican Senate among Republican Senate candidates, among Republican House candidates. Democratic candidates started to realize it, but similar to the way that it came a little bit too late to the Harris campaign, it came a little bit too late to them as well. But I do think that 2024 fundamentally changed the way that we're going to talk about the gender gap, because it's no longer going to be about making a play for women. It's going to be making a play for both sexes and probably, sort of fostering as much a war of the sexes as you possibly can.
That's fascinating. What do you think are likely policy outcomes of that change in political emphasis or political shift?
I don't think it matters that much. No. Okay. So, I think we're so polarized. The reality is that Americans, voters in general, are still far more moderate than the elected officials that represent them. We see this not only in gerrymandered districts in the House, but even in the Senate, where there is no gerrymandering. So, everything is based on whether there's a D or an R in front of your name right now. Yeah. And what we saw in 2024 is that there are tons of voters out there that you can get for the first time, right? Like, a lot of people thought that Trump's strategy was pretty risky. Like, he was going to go out and try to drive up the margins in these red areas that he'd already won. Like, there must not be any other Republicans to vote. No, they're there. And the Democrats can do the same thing. So I don't think it's going to, I don't think it changes that much.
Yeah, so super interesting. And, I do wonder, obviously we all wonder which way things are going. But one thing that I found interesting, I read something recently on AOC Trump voters. So, it's a non-zero group, right, of people who voted in AOC's district for Trump. And, she asked him, I think she sent a tweet out or something and said, well, why'd you do that? And, I think the dominant message from this group, which I think is actually big enough to potentially swing things one way or another, was something like, you both care about us, right? That was their, whether that's true or not, we can argue. But that was at least the perception of this group. And that makes me wonder, how does somebody like AOC potentially campaign? Let's suppose she campaigns in 2028. My intuition is that, all those Bernie Sanders supporters are probably super disaffected right now, ready to kind of, maybe some of them who haven't voted, in the recent cycle, super ready to kind of jump in, and she's well positioned to take them, male and female. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe from what you're saying, it's really she really needs to just focus on, pick her side and maybe focus on the women's vote. And
so I think in primaries, everybody in your party and independents in open, in open primary states are there for the picking. the problem becomes that in the general election, despite this sliver of like the AOC Trump voters, split ticket voting is almost non-existent now, and it's continued to get lower and lower. So at that point in the general election, I think when you're trying to figure out how do I get 50% plus one in my district, you want the most efficient route to get there. So you can try to convince these people who might not automatically be in your camp that you're for them. But that involves many more resources than just making sure that the people that you know you can count on turn out and then they tell 7 of their friends. So, you know, it's not, there isn't one recipe, but I do think that assuming that everybody wants to be every candidate wants to be as efficient as they possibly can and mitigate uncertainty to the extent that they can, they're not going to think about casting a wider net.
Yeah. And so, I think many people, including me, have the perception that our democracy may be broken in a lot of ways. And, I guess one question is, well, what has broken it? And, I think one common explanation is something like, well, we have this median voter theorem, right? The idea that ultimately the median voter is going to control things, but then we have these primaries. And so maybe you end up with something like the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile voter as each party goes there, and then they can kind of move a little toward the center, but not very much, so we don't get very close to the center. But maybe that's not really what's broken, and maybe what's really more fundamentally broken has to do with what you're talking about in terms of the ability that what really matters is the ability to motivate a base that usually is not likely to vote. And so if your strategy has to be, hey, there's maybe different segments of voters, and maybe it's maybe that includes some of those Bernie Sanders supporters, whether it's the primary or not. Maybe it includes some of the people who maybe didn't get out to vote for Trump in 2020, but he somehow managed to motivate in 2024. If it's really about how do I motivate this kind of somewhat eccentric, largely not politically involved group, you could see much greater shifts potentially from one presidency to the next than even if we imagined a world in which we have the median voter theorem, but primaries kind of mess it up a little bit.
All right, so with an eye on the time, I want to turn to you guys and take questions from the audience. I mean, I have more things, but yeah, go ahead, sir.
I have a question for Professor Lawless about your more sexist idea. When I was a political science student, I spent a lot of time with Kathy Kramer's rural resentment theory. And I'm wondering if this shift we're seeing can be explained as a parallel pro-resentment idea. And if so, how do you make white men feel like they're not being left behind as a politician?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's totally consistent with Kathy's work. And it's basically consistent with a long line of scholarship that Nick Carnes, who's done a lot about blue collar, why do no blue collar people get elected? Why don't they run for office in the first place? This general sense that the system has left people behind, right? And when you have this resentment or when you feel like you're not being included, you look for an alternative. And one of the best alternatives is the person that doesn't at all look the part. So Trump was able to tap into that in 2016 and again in 2024. In 2020, it was a little bit different because he was the incumbent, right? So like, it's fascinating to me that in 2024, people forgot that middle administration, right? Like it's a total referendum on, I remember what it was like in 2019. Then this whole COVID thing happened. We pretended it didn't happen. And so I think for candidates, the challenge becomes, and this is, the Democrats have not figured out how to do it, letting people know that their personal experiences are real and their feelings are legitimate, yet there isn't this systematic bias or discrimination against them, right? And so we see this a lot of the time. It used to be that candidates would often, like if you were running for office and you were running against somebody with like a really compelling life story, but the person was terrible for you, you had to basically give voters permission to like that person and still vote against them. Here, I think what the Democrats need to do is give people permission to say, look, my life is really crummy right now, and I need a candidate who's going to help me, but I understand that in the broader context of things, I'm one person. And we saw that with the economy messaging. Like it was not effective. When people don't feel like they have disposable income, it doesn't work when Democratic candidates are like, what are you talking about? The economic indicators are excellent, right? Like it makes people feel like, so I think they've got to figure out how to thread that needle where they validate an individual person's experience, but are still able to provide a broader context about how things are moving in the right direction. We also know this sort of gets back to the idea of like, people don't know about margins of error. People are terrible with rates. So like, even if the inflation rate is going down, by definition, prices are still going up, just at a slower rate. And so talking about it in mathematical terms like that doesn't resonate. So I think the Democrats have to figure that out. What Donald Trump and a lot of the Republicans did really well was not engage in any of those nuances. They just said, you're totally right. The Biden economy doesn't work for you. It's harder to do that when you're the incumbent. And we'll see what happens in 2028.
I just have to add, you mentioned, we forgot the COVID part. I think though, you guys are much more expert in this than me. I think the COVID dislocation is actually a large part of the male disaffection, that or why they feel like this isn't working for them. It's the DEI is sort of the new excuse, but it's that the economy became terrible in 2020, and that was also concurrent with the post-George Floyd protests and the policy shifts. And so I think a lot of the lingering effects of the COVID shock, because we've sort of memory hold that COVID happened, people are attributing to the DEI changes because they were sort of at the same time, even though one of them is really the much more salient cause.
I mean, it could also, I think that COVID may be a huge explanation. I mean, I certainly just saw it in my, my kids, and change from my older kid to my younger, to my middle child, in terms of how there was really a big change in very liberal Arlington, Virginia, in the number of people who were pretty out as Republicans from a very low number to a pretty high number, right following COVID. And so I do wonder whether COVID may be the answer. But I think what happens, of course, is people, people are probably not deeply committed on very many political issues. And so they, they'll try to rationalize and they'll try to sort of make their worldviews cohere. But if one of your central worldviews is, the Democrats really messed up my life in COVID, suddenly a lot more kind of anti-Democrat attitudes seem a lot more appealing, that you might not actually really have such deep connections to, but you heard Joe Rogan say something about COVID, and then you listen to him say something about a bunch of other topics. So, I do think it's interesting, and I don't know if you know of any evidence on this, but it's an interesting counter theory, right? That maybe it's not all social media that's bringing people apart. Maybe really COVID was this singular event that actually, for some reason, of course, it affected girls and women too. Yeah. But for some reason, perhaps that actually had much more of a polarizing effect.
I mean, that's possible. I read some really interesting works in psychology about COVID, which is people like to distance themselves from horrible things that happened. Mm-hmm. And so part of the reason why the reference point for whether to reelect Trump was like December of 2019 instead of December, October of 2020, was because in that gap, like hundreds of thousands of people were dying, people were locked down. So forget like your own economic interest or whatever, just that entire time period, people wanted to skip and avoid. And I think that the Biden and then the Harris campaign to some extent understood that and had read some of that, which is why they weren't constantly bringing up COVID, because there was evidence to suggest that it was demobilizing. But as a result, they then didn't have the ability to bash Trump for his COVID response or to question why he was using not the end of his term as a reference point, but a year prior to that. So I think COVID, even if it's sort of not a singular event the way that you're describing it, I think the implications of what happened during that certainly played a role in 2024.
Very interesting. Other questions? Maddie, yeah.
I have a question for Professor Abramowicz.
Abramowicz, yes.
I was curious about, like, Professor Pollack had mentioned, like, feeling like these, like, election cycles of the betting and whatnot, that creates an icky feeling for him. And for me, it made me feel like it kind of depersonalizes politics in a way that, like, makes me uncomfortable, like, with the example of, like, the pleading and on his knees and crying. Like, it makes it a very, like, deep personal experience, like, you're thinking about who you're electing. So, like, do you think, like, the betting can have an implication in that way?
Yeah, so, it kind of coming back to this kind of question of that, the meme that kind of went along with the prediction market. I mean, to me, I would put that more on the social media side. I mean, right. I don't know why, why they needed to come up with that AI generated generated image, but politics may serve some kind of function of telling people that there are people out there who care about them. I mean, certainly politicians purport to care about voters, and if it just seems like all people are doing is running the numbers, maybe that is depersonalizing. I think it can be potentially beneficial, though, to have a little bit of depersonalization, because I think some of the extent to which politics is personalized, I think contributes to some of the kind of polarization and feelings of being neglected that we're talking about. And so I guess I like the idea of trying to make politics more technocratic in lots of ways. I mean, I've talked about some others in my work. I've talked about, for example, having more randomized controlled trials about, with political institutions so that we can make law more like medicine, for example, where we try things. Now, maybe that's kind of depersonalizing too, to say, well, we don't know what's best, so let's just try different things. But I also think that ultimately, that can get us closer to the right answer and closer to agreement than, I guess, I feel your pain, as in the words of Bill Clinton.
Josh.
So I guess a question for both of you, though I think it probably might be in more of Professor Abramowicz's wheelhouse, but be very curious for both of your thoughts. So I think one sort of open question in political donations is do candidates who raise more money win because they have more money, or do people just not want to throw money at losers, right? Because ultimately, when you're making a political contribution, it's somewhat of a gamble, right? You want to gain influence, you want to, if someone doesn't win, then you've just effectively wasted your money. And when talking about betting markets, that seems to be a similar mode, right? That you're only going to put, as you were saying, right? You'd only put money where your mouth is when you're fairly confident of something. So I wonder if anyone's sort of taken a look at the correlation between the two to sort of figure out how this might relate to theories of like political contributions, right? Is there any sort of correlation between the two there?
Good question. I don't know of any such research. You may know
I do not.
better. Okay. So really good question, right? And I don't think there's been that much research on prediction markets. I don't know, I guess what I've done, but and some others, but not a whole lot of really great academic research. So I think there are a lot of avenues for thinking about it, and that's a good avenue.
What I can say is that although it's true that in almost all congressional races, who the candidate that raised the most money wins, at the presidential level, that's no longer the case, because there's basically, once you raise a certain amount, you can't even spend it all. And so as long as you achieve, if you raise money early to demonstrate your legitimacy, once you achieve like some threshold, everything over that is gravy. And so at the presidential level, it's not as predictive anymore.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I just have a question about, like, how do you square away the feeling of like men, in particular like white men, feeling left behind, and like the inclination of the betting markets towards Trump, when like men are more likely to be, white men in specific are more likely to be the highest income earners, and according to like all of the Gallup polling, like majority of like voters making over 100,000 were voting for Democrats versus like voted maybe less than 100 voted for Republicans. Like, how do you square that away? Just like comparing those two variables together.
Well, so I think there are two different things going on. So the first is that you can vote for Trump and you can participate in these markets with a relatively small amount of money involved, right? And so a lot of the people, you can have both of those things be true at the same time, right? The second thing is you can feel, and a lot of the men that he mobilized, and the young men in particular, are not making over $100,000. So the new group of people that have been motivated to get involved, especially those who believe that something was taken from them, are often young men who have never gotten to the point where anything could be taken from them yet, right? It's sort of like anticipation anxiety of what happens if you're 35 and you're still living in your parents' basement. And so that's part of what's happening here. Politics, we've long known that perception is way more important than reality across the board. And I think that's part of what we're seeing.
Also maybe like a way, especially for those men, like to sort of inoculate themselves against potential future failure, right? It's like, well, let's set up now that if I fail in the future, this is why. Sort of some emotional management. Wilfred, yeah.
Thank you for the panel. It's been great so far. But I'd like it to keep going. And so my question is, gentlemen, the way that I'm hearing it, and you seem to be
more on the sort of equality side, bringing out these issues of inequality, whether it's class, race, especially gender in markets. And Michael, you seem to be more on the sort of libertarian side, where like this is going to happen. We need to just see it through. And I guess, you know, I see this. What I have not heard much about is this sort of regulatory apparatus, and you know, whether we think about this from a libertarian perspective or a sort of egalitarian perspective, we do recognize, it seems, that there are some ills, and most sort of sin activities, we kind of tax, we regulate, we do these things that try to mitigate those, or at least sort of ensure that, you know, those problems are going to be put to some productive usage, right? Like we can tax something, use that money towards fixing the problem. Can you speak, I guess, about any sort of ideas or existing frames for regulating this and how they sort of engage with all the sort of negative aspects at least that we're seeing?
Sure. So I mean, most of the regulatory discussion around prediction markets have really focused more on, you know, the traditional kinds of things that people focus on with regard to securities markets, you know, fraud, you know, you could talk about market liquidity, things like that. And there's been a lot of debate about what the role of the government should be in regulating these. Recently, there's been more discussion about, so the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, is the agency that's been kind of most focused on. Recently, some of that debate has concerned really the role of government in politics. And so some arguments made by the CFTC recently, but in the Biden administration, focused on this kind of idea that because they usually worry about those, you know, kinds of things like market fraud and so forth, they may not be well positioned to actually regulate potential sabotage, for example, of prediction markets with the goal of, you know, of changing election results. And so one might argue for regulation of these prediction markets, or for banning prediction markets more likely, based on this concern that people might manipulate the election by manipulating the prediction markets. For reasons that probably we don't have time to go into, I don't think that's that great a concern. I actually think if you wanted to sabotage elections, there are probably a lot better ways of doing it than interfering with the prediction market. But I do think that is kind of a new ingredient that people have kind of put into this area. But I think there's this broader question, you know, because it relates to debates about things like misinformation and to what extent should government be regulating misinformation. And I don't know that I'm a libertarian in general, but I think on this issue I tend to be, because I'm very worried about the prospect of allowing whoever the current administration happens to be at any given time to have some role in determining what counts as misinformation and what doesn't. And so I think, you know, it sounds great, the idea, you know, it's just, to me, the same kind of concern about saying, hey, should we allow the president to expel people from the country because they engaged in protests that now they say are bad for, you know, our country's national security. You know, I worry very much about these powers, even though I think they might be sometimes used well, because I think the other side, whichever side that might be, could use them badly. So I worry about that with misinformation. I also worry about giving political actors too great a role in regulating really anything related to communication of surrounding politics.
So I generally agree. What I will say about misinformation is I certainly don't think an administration that changes potentially every 4 years should have that role. But what we are seeing is that there has been a major disincentive for any of these outside entities to do it now because of their relationships with this administration. And to me, that's very, very concerning, because if Facebook is no longer fact checking, if the Washington Post no longer cares about this kind of stuff, like at some point, these relationships with an administration are as though the administration is determining what should and should not be said, or what is real or not real. So I think it's a little bit more, it's hard to figure out what to do, because we've created a situation where there's no incentive for an outside entity to step in and play that role.
I do just want to say, by way of on this topic, if Craig Holman were with us. So Craig works at Public Citizen, which is a think tank and lobbying organization based in Washington, D.C. A lot of his recent work has been about the question of CFTC regulation of prediction markets. He's in favor of it. He's in favor of the regulation, and wrote a very lengthy, public comment. In the CFTC had opened up a comment period, and so if you're interested in this issue, I encourage you. You can just Google it, public citizen prediction market CFTC. You'll find his comment. It's quite passionate, quite scholarly and thought out, and it speaks directly to this issue. So we are about at time. Hopefully maybe our panelists can stick around for a few minutes, and if folks want to ask them some questions, they're more than welcome to do so. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, guys.